There we go. Okay, so nice. So we're going to talk about waterfall spectrograms. So this is kind of really important in the world of Wi-Fi. We have to understand what is happening in the air. We can't see these colors, we can't see the light that is Wi-Fi in the air. So we need tools in order to help us out. And a spectrum analyzer is one of those. We have one built into every Sapphire Eye, of course, but you can get these things anywhere. Lots of, you can run them from your PC, or there are handheld tools like by Fluke where you can walk around with these things. So we're going to talk about these today, and we're going to go through a bunch of really cool examples of interference, and we're going to discuss it. Jim and I talk about what we're seeing, give you our advice on what you can do about it. So here we go. What is a spectrum analyzer? Quite simply, guys, it's measuring magnitude of signals. Okay, now the spectrum remember, we're talking about unlicensed spectrum here. So the spectrum analyzers that we use are measuring what's going on in the 2.4 gigahertz frequency band and then the 5 gigahertz frequency band. We don't have spectrum analyzers that are measuring what's going on in other frequency bands. Okay, we're not really allowed to do that. Those are licensed by the FCC. But when it comes to the frequencies that are unlicensed, we can use systems and tools in order to see what is going on in there. Again, we're measuring the magnitude of the input signal within the range. And why do we do this? We're trying to do this because we're trying to see the invisible. Okay, we're trying to see what is going on. And some of these patterns we recognize, and some of these spectral patterns we don't recognize. And we're going to talk about that as well. Let's talk about the parts of the graph. So first, on the y-axis, we have time when we're talking about waterfall. So we're waterfalling from the beginning of the week to the end of the week, as you can see here. So it just so happens that in our system, we're able to store 2 weeks of spectral data. And so that's why we're able to actually run this report where we can actually see and catch what was happening in the air yesterday, the day before, or last week for that matter. Sometimes when you're just walking around with a handheld, it's just, hey, what's happening right now? And, it's like trying to catch a ghost sometimes. If you think that there's interference, it comes, it goes, it's hard to figure out. So this is kind of a neat thing in that we're actually able to see what is happening over the course of the day, over the course of the week. Now, on the x-axis, we've got the channels. Okay, and so you can see here channel 36, channel 40, this is 5 gigahertz. And then of course, we're going to use color in order to help us measure the magnitude of the frequency, with red being really hot, strong signal, going all the way down here to the blue and the turquoise and the purple, where it's much cooler. There isn't a lot of signal. So we use all 3 of these elements in order to help us understand what's going on. And of course, and here is the chart where we're waterfalling from the beginning of the week to the end of the week. And so if we look here on channel 40, you can see a lot of energy on channel 40. It's a fairly used channel, if you will. And actually in this spectrum here, this is at our office. There's a lot of channels that are in use. There is basically activity on every single channel in our office, as you can see here. So, and again, it's like I like to refer to it as a slug leaving a spectral trail of energy behind as it works its way from the beginning of the week to the end of the week, and it's leaving behind the energy. Okay, so what we're going to do, guys, is we're actually going to take a look at some examples of this. But before we do that, let's just review super quickly here with regards to what we're talking about here. This interference, okay, it's like noise. This gets in the way of our Wi-Fi signals. If the client can't hear the radio because it's too noisy, then it's going to lead to a retransmission. Hey, I didn't catch that message. Can you send that again, please? And vice versa. It happens in both directions. We have access point retransmissions and we have client retransmissions. And again, it's just so noisy, can't get through. Got to say that again. And typically what happens in these environments is that the data rate that's negotiated between the access point and the client will step down. in an attempt to try to find a lower data rate that's more robust. Those low, slow data rates are more they're more sturdy, they're more robust, if you will. It's kind of like trying to drive up a really steep hill in fifth gear. You're never going to do it. Okay, you've got to downshift into first or second gear in order to cut through the gravity. With Wi-Fi, if it's really noisy in the environment, it's going to step down to a lower, slower data rate that's more robust to try to cut through the noise, if you will. Okay. Now, one of the temptations here sometimes is, hey, well, why don't we just turn up the volume? Why don't we just yell over top of everybody? And that's sometimes not a good idea. Generally speaking, it's not. When you try to boost the signal to overcome the noise, then oftentimes you become the nuisance in the environment. And not only that, but if these adjacent radios here have some type of automation in them, they may boost their signals as well. And then you're right back where you started with just a really loud, noisy environment. The idea, the reason why we use a spectrogram, the reason why we like spectrum analysis is because it allows us to see the noisy parts of the spectrum so that we can go someplace quiet. That's the key, guys. Remember, this is unlicensed spectrum. Okay, you may see something on the spectrogram and you're like, what is that? I don't know. But you know what? It's unlicensed spectrum. They're allowed pretty much within just some loose fitting rules to do whatever they want. That being the case, I'm just going to need to set up shop somewhere else on the spectrum. And that's why these systems and tools are so powerful. They allow me to see where the action is so that I can avoid it, so that I can get away from it. It's kind of like you go into a really noisy sports bar and everybody's cheering and yelling and you can't even talk to the person right across from you. And it's frustrating. It's like, what? What did you say? Right? You got to retry. If you want to talk to that person, hey, you see the patio over there? Let's go out on the patio and have a nice conversation. Go someplace quiet. All right, so Jim, with that said, we're going to take a look at some 2.4 gigahertz spectral graphs today. And and away we go. Hey, what do you think of this one?
Yeah, and attendees, if you want to drop in the chat what you think we're showing here too. But this one looks, to me, pretty healthy, looking at the 2.4 gigahertz band and just seeing a couple columns of Wi-Fi and the channels where we want to see it, 1, 6, and 11.
Exactly. 20 megahertz wide. So this column is channel 1, channel 6 in the middle, and channel 11. And you know what, Jim? It's nice and cool and blue in between, which is exactly what you want to see.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to our next one. Ooh, already we're starting to get a little messy here, aren't we?
Yes.
So you'll see on a lot of these 2.4 spectral charts, you've got these spikes that go from top to bottom over here on the right, over here on the left, and also one right here in between 1 and 2. Jim, can you just give a little insight as to what those spikes are that you see all the time? Yep.
Yeah, and I'm just going to use some annotation tools here to highlight those, but those are very, very, very common in today's spectrum world in the 2.4 gigahertz band. And I see a lot of people in the chat saying it's Bluetooth, and that's exactly right. These three specific narrowband transmitters are the Bluetooth low energy advertising channels, where devices just ping away, not like a real ping, but they transmit like a Wi-Fi beacon almost continuously just to advertise their presence to other devices.
Exactly. And then, like, for instance, sometimes you see it really light up red hot, like right here. And it's interesting because when you see it light up red hot like this, it corresponds with this activity, this Bluetooth activity that is cutting across the spectrum left to right. Why is that, Jim?
Yeah, so the advertising just happens on those 3 channels, but when Bluetooth needs to shift into a data transferring mode, it actually frequency hops across the whole band and uses all of the available spectrum it can in 2.4 gigahertz. Now it does have a feature called adaptive frequency hopping, where it tries to avoid channels that are occupied, and it will try to avoid a Wi-Fi transmitter if it's there. But if you've got busy APs on channels 1, 6, and 11, there's not a lot of spectrum available for Bluetooth. And if there's enough density, there's going to be interference and it's going to get ugly.
Yeah, absolutely true. All right, let's take a look at our next example here. This is very interesting. Again, you can see the advertising taking place, but not a whole lot of Bluetooth activity because I don't really see them lit up pretty, hot, and I don't see a whole lot of streaking left and right. But what is interesting is the channel width. This is, so you can see the full 20 megahertz wide channel kind of stretches from where my mouse is right here all the way to where my mouse is right here. But as you can see, a majority of the activity is not reaching from coast to coast, if you will. Jim, what are we seeing here?
We're seeing a different spectral mask for Wi-Fi. So we're used to seeing it kind of very kind of a strong signal across the full channel width, the full 20 megahertz, because the spectral mask is almost like a square. But this is more round, where it's stronger near the center. And that's the old school 802.11b spectral mask that you see when low data rates are in use in 2.4 gigahertz.
Aha. So this
looks like Michael got that one in the chat. Nice work, Michael.
So when you say B and low data rates, this could potentially be like a 6 megabit per second data rate or a 2 megabit per second data rate, something along those lines.
It would be 1, 2, 5.5, or 11.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's, obviously pretty slow. I mean, what I do just as kind of a poor man's calculation is whatever the data rate is that's negotiated between a client and an access point, I just cut it in half. And that's pretty much about what you'd probably be experiencing from a Wi-Fi throughput standpoint. So if it's 5.5, then if the data rate is 5.5, then you're probably only getting a couple megabits per second of throughput. That could be very slow going depending upon the application. So, be on the lookout for that. You want to get slow clients off your network. You want to raise the minimum basic rate, turn off those low, slow data rates, make your minimum basic rate. What do you suggest, Jim? 12? Is that what it really should be?
Yeah, 12 is a good starting point, and maybe go higher or lower depending on the requirements of the design.
Awesome. Okay, let's move on to our next example. Ooh, ouch. So this is Bluetooth in full effect, Jim.
Yeah.
You can see how red hot it is on the BLE beacon, and how it's just dramatic. And here's the thing, guys, is that it's dramatic. Look at the y-axis. You see how it's really dramatic. This is what? This is like 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon during the day here, and then it goes away at night. It goes away at night. And this is a really important thing to remember when it comes to interference, is that it comes and goes. And so it's sometimes very hard to catch. And that's very frustrating for people who say, yeah, I'm having this problem. And then, that was last night. And then you go into the area with your system, your tools, and you can't see anything wrong. And so, there are certain times of the day when there's going to be a lot of activity, and other times where there's less activity. And it's really nice to be able to see, again, time on the y-axis. Now, here's our next one. Now, Jim, this is really interesting. The reason why is because now look at this here. See the Bluetooth spike here going from top to bottom. Okay, it's like it's a certain width. These little spikes look like they're a little different, don't they?
They do. Yeah, those are just 1 or 2 megahertz wide, and those are the frequency hopping channels that the Bluetooth transmitter has settled on using. It will dynamically drop and add channels from the channels it's hopping to and from, but this one seems to have selected I don't know, maybe a dozen or so there that it's just using all the time.
All the time. That's right. I mean, when you see it from the beginning of the week to the end of the week, or from the beginning of the day to the end of the day, and it's going from top to bottom like this, just think of it as the duty cycle. It's on 24/7, right?
Yeah.
And there is no better example of that than this right here. Oh my gosh. This is where, the channel 1 has been pretty much completely destroyed. And anybody trying to use it would be in really bad shape. So again, duty cycle 100% top to bottom. Jim, these spikes look very, very peculiar. I think if I recall correctly, this is an example in a hospital where there was a charging station that was filled with Bluetooth hearing aids.
Well, yeah, and I don't think they were Bluetooth. I think it was just a custom like analog radio technology they were using.
Yeah, and that's important. Again, it's unlicensed spectrum. I mean, they don't have to conform to the 802.11 protocol, do they, Jim?
Nope, don't have to be 802.11, don't have to be Bluetooth, don't have to be a digital technology at all. They can just be an analog transmitter that's sending a signal for whatever purpose.
Right.
One of the things that kind of gives you that clue that it's probably analog is that the signal is just constant. The level never changes. Basically, whenever the system is running, it's just transmitting. And yeah, Kit makes a comment in the chat, like wireless microphones, very good example of that. They just transmit all the time. And the signal is just 100% duty cycle. Digital signals are usually much more dynamic. There's a transmission when there's data to go across the link, and otherwise there's empty space in between. So
yeah. Now, fortunately here, channel 11 still looks pretty healthy over here. And you can see there's some Wi-Fi energy taking place over here. So that's good news.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to our next one. Yikes. So yeah, again, the whole, bottom end of the spectrum here has been destroyed by what looks like Bluetooth interference.
Yeah, you can see Bluetooth for sure here. And one of the telltale signs too is like this kind of background washboard kind of look to it.
Yeah.
Where each of the 40 or so Bluetooth channels has some utilization in it. But what's going on the left side that's just annihilating the bottom half of the spectrum it's hard to tell, but it's very loud and very present.
Absolutely. All right, let's continue on. Interesting. Okay, so this is really, really interesting for a couple of reasons, Jim. So one is that we can see low data rates in effect here. It looks like there is occasionally some higher data rates in effect as the channel widens out a little bit. Obviously, channel 6, channel 1, very hot to trot. This line right here is very peculiar to me. If you recall, when we were talking about BLE and the advertising, it was happening on the other side of channel 6, not this side of channel 6. Jim, what is going on here?
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation, because at first it does kind of look like a BLE advertising channel, but it is on the wrong side of channel 6. And because it's maybe 2 or 3 megahertz wide, that makes me suspect that this is an 802.15.4 transmitter, something like Zigbee or Thread or something like that that's used for IoT operations.
Yeah, okay. And if anybody has some suggestions out there in the chat, that would be great as well. But yeah, very peculiar, very peculiar. All right, let's take a look at the next example that we have on 2.4 before we get into 5 gigahertz. Ooh, this is pretty nasty, Jim. And again, this is our Bluetooth interference, really just destroying most of the spectrum here, making it not usable.
Yeah, Bluetooth, low data rates, and just, so much energy across the whole band. It's really going to make Wi-Fi suffer, because Wi-Fi transmitters will defer and wait to transmit until until it doesn't detect a signal or any energy on the channel, and there's a lot of energy out there on those channels.
And it's any energy, right, Jim? I mean, it's
Yeah.
not just, oh, I detect other, 802.11. The clear channel assessment is pretty sensitive.
Yeah. So it's most sensitive to 802.11. That's where it's actually very sensitive. You can detect signals from other Wi-Fi transmitters that are very quiet with just 4 decibels of SNR. But then it uses the CCA does a process called energy detect to look for non-Wi-Fi sources of energy. And that's not as sensitive. It's about 20 dB above the signal detect threshold. So non-Wi-Fi sources of interference are so bad because a lot of times a Wi-Fi transmitter will just transmit into it without recognizing it's there, and then the signal will get corrupted. But if it's really loud like here, yeah, that's going to trip energy detect, and it's just going to sit there and drop packets and buffer.
Yeah, and that's important to note. I mean, how loud is the energy? Another reason why we like the spectrum analyzer is because it magnifies, it shows the intensity, which, as we know, is really important in Wi-Fi.
Yeah. A couple of questions there about like what Bluetooth devices could be doing this. And one of the things that comes up is phone accessories, wireless earbuds, watches, all those things that people just have with them. And, they're just listening to tunes, they're taking a call, and that's just a constant source of Bluetooth data transfer.
Yeah.
The other one, I think there was a comment previously, it was call centers sometimes make the mistake of having a big open room with 100 desks in it and giving every single person at a desk a Bluetooth headset.
Yeah.
And it just, the density is too high and the whole thing falls apart.
Oh, yeah. And not only that, add in the Bluetooth mice and the keyboards.
Yes.
And now you're really in trouble. I know that on my desk, I have a Bluetooth speaker where I like to, listen to music from my iPhone. So there's another contributor as well, right?
Yep.
All right, let's look at this next one. Oh, wow, look at this. This is really interesting. Again, you can clearly see the Wi-Fi energy underneath, obviously channel 1, channel 6, channel 11. But then look at this, only during the day. Again, use the Y-axis in order to see time of day. So starting at around, 8 or 9 in the morning, there's all of this Bluetooth energy. This is exactly what we're talking about. Maybe, this is when the call center fills up with all of its agents. And then here in the afternoon, around 4:30, 5 o'clock, everybody goes home and it's gone.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's interesting too is the advertising traffic is gone too. We don't see the advertising channels lit up in between. So that tells me that probably most of these Bluetooth devices are transient. We're just traveling with people when they occupy the area, earbuds, Bluetooth speakers, so on and so forth. And then they leave when people leave, and we don't pick up their advertising traffic anymore.
Yeah, they take it with them, right?
Yeah.
All right, this next one is really interesting. Jim, you just showed this to me recently. It was something that I had never seen before that you had picked up. I believe you said it was at an airport.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us what we're seeing here?
Yeah, this is from a major airport in the UK, and kind of classic example of very, very busy Bluetooth interference occurring. But also, look at this. Major source of interference down there around 2407 megahertz. We don't know what that is, but it was, perhaps an analog transmitter you see for several hours throughout the night. This thing is just transmitting nonstop. It's definitely not Wi-Fi. One of our attendees thinks it's ghosts. Maybe it is. Actually, it really doesn't matter what it is. What's important is that we bring our APs and away from it so that our users aren't going to be impacted by that, whatever it is. Of course, there's so many Spectrum users in an airport that good luck even figuring it out.
Yeah. And that's a really good point, Jim. You know, a lot of people say, "Hey, can you tell me what it is exactly?" And again, it might not even matter. The point is that if we're dealing with unlicensed spectrum here, it could really be anything, proprietary, not proprietary, something that you can do something about, something you can't do something about. I mean, you're not going to identify, well, maybe in an airport, this is some kind of new sophisticated wireless system for managing baggage claim. Well, what are you going to do? You're going to walk over and unplug it? Of course not.
Yeah.
The point is that you use the spectrum analyzer to identify what is actually going on so that you can avoid it. And that's the point that we were making earlier.
Yeah. If you're seeing it in the spectrum analyzer, that means it's already been purchased, it's already been deployed, it's already operational.
Right.
The chance to stop it has passed, and now we just have to detect it and live with it.
Right. That's exactly right. Now, speaking of detecting and living with it, Jim, could you live with this?
Yeah, so this is an example I like because it shows how transient some of these things are. This source of interference just showed up for a couple hours one day and then never came back. So this is where having historical spectrogram information is useful, because my my guess is this was somebody's hotspot, cellular hotspot they turned up with a 40 megahertz channel, and maybe they were, who knows, downloading a movie or something, like some huge, very busy activity was going on, and then they turned it off and left, and damage done. And the only way to know what actually happened was to have this historical data to see, oh yeah, something was really wrecking the 2.4 gigahertz band there for a little while.
Yeah, look at this in the middle of the night, right? Somebody doing like a BitTorrent or something, in the middle of the
Yeah,
night, and then it was done in the morning, and
because
they
we
went up.
have, we have there's our AP on channel 1, there's our AP on channel 6,
Yep.
and there's our AP on channel 11. Those
Yep.
columns that we just kind of, those slugs moving down the spectrogram that we just expect to see, and that all looks normal. But this big red rectangle out of the blue that just showed up and left for about, looking again at the time here, about 2.5 hours. That's where we detect the interference.
Right. It's like a bloody crime scene. Okay, so now we're going to segue into 5 gigahertz. Let's take a look at a few examples there, because there is interference on 5 gigahertz. We're seeing it. And so let's take a look at what that is together. So Jim, to me, this looks pretty normal. What do you think?
Yeah, it looks very normal. 5 gigahertz was very light utilization, just the slug trails from APs, but not very busy. So a lot of available capacity. You love to see a spectrogram that looks like that.
Yeah, right on. All right, this next one also looks pretty normal. However, a bit more activity. You can clearly see that there are some channels that are much more heavily utilized than others. I'm looking at channel 100, for example, right?
Yeah. Yep. More APs, more activity. And yeah, this is a good example of showing what a busier AP looks like compared to other APs that aren't quite as loaded.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes it's good to look and see, whoa, wait a minute here. Why are these channels so much more heavily utilized than others? And that's another reason why I like to see the color and the intensity in the spectral chart as well. All right. Wow. This looks interesting. So correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, but this kind of looks like an 80 megahertz wide channel bonding action taking place here. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. We kind of see all at the same time, those channels 100, 104, 108, and 112 all lit up.
Mm-hmm.
And then this one, channel 108, is the busiest, and that's the primary channel. So all the management traffic and control traffic is just sent 20 megahertz wide within that channel. And so it's always much more active than the secondary channels when we use wider channels. So this is a good way to see that. In fact, we only use that full channel width when we're sending data frames back and forth.
Jim, is it odd that the primary channel is right in the middle of those four channels? Isn't it usually, like in this case, it would be 100? And is there any danger in having it your primary channel on one side of the bonded channel versus the other? Anything at all to be concerned about?
Yeah, there are some concerns if there are overlapping APs. We want the primary channels to overlap. We don't want to overlap primary and secondary channels. That's a pretty nasty form of co-channel interference that's known as primary secondary OBSS, which could be a whole webinar in itself. And I think I've talked about that in some previous webinars, but that's a pretty ugly thing we don't want to do.
Okay, great. Oh, wow. So this is very interesting. So Jim, this looks like a whole lot, not a busy spectrum at all, like we saw previously, but a whole lot of channel changes taking place. For example, look over here. This is channel 36, 40, 44. It's kind of, humming along really good. And then all of a sudden the Wi-Fi slug jumps its track and it kind of ends up over here and starts going, right? And I don't know why it did that, but it did. And this, if these types of changes are happening in the middle of the day all the time, this could be pretty disruptive, right?
Yeah, this is a curious one because we see a lot of APs. We don't see them. We don't see a lot of activity. And you're right, Eric. Like if you look at this example, look at what happens, the state of the channel after this AP leaves channel 44.
Yeah,
It looks like it's empty. So where did it go and why did it go there? Very curious as to, why we're seeing all these changes into away from channels that look pretty unoccupied.
yeah.
Thomas in the chat says RRM, and that would be, my number one suspect when looking at this.
Got to be careful with RRM. By default, it'll just run that algorithm every 15 or every 30 minutes unnecessarily sometimes. And again, could be problematic in the middle of the day. So you just need to keep an eye on that, keep watch on that. This is, again, using the spectral, the spectrogram is a way to see what is going on. All right, let's take a look at our next example. Ooh, this is very nasty. Jim, I don't know what this is, but this is really, check this out. So it goes from all the way on the left side of the spectrum here. There's some kind of wideband interference. It kind of disappears into the abyss of licensed spectrum, only to pick up on the other side and continue. I don't know, Jim, but if anybody was on the Wi-Fi network at this time, 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon, this could have been very disruptive.
Yeah, very disruptive across the whole band. It's kind of a mystery to me. I think this is the only case where I've seen a spectrogram that looks like this. Yeah. Now, there is a Wi-Fi AP up there on channel 161. That's looking like it's using a wider channel width.
Yeah.
But and that's very, very busy. But what these are across the whole 5 gigahertz band virtually.
That is nasty.
That's nasty. And that's a tough one to troubleshoot too, because as you can see, it's just momentarily there. And then it may be another day or longer before it shows up again.
Yeah. And if this is in a specific area and, this is affecting all channels during those time periods, this is rare, but if this is occurring in an environment, it may be cause for alarm and cause for a greater or a deeper investigation, trying to get up close to the issue to identify, is there some kind of equipment that is perhaps causing this problem, that is knocking everybody else off of the Wi-Fi network, taking up the complete width of the spectrum at this time. So, all right, let's go to our next one here. Oh, wow. So what I think we're seeing here, Jim, is correct me if I'm wrong, but this kind of looks like a 160 megahertz wide channel, no?
Yeah, it is. We don't see that very often, but that's what's going on here. At AP configured for 160 megahertz channel width. and very clear that the primary channel is right here.
Yeah, in the middle.
Yeah, that's, I think, channel 48 there, with much more utilization there. And then just occasionally you have a client capable of transmitting 160 megahertz channel width,
Yeah.
which many are not, by the way.
Yeah, you could see 40 over here. There's a lot more 40 going on than it seems, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, a lot more 40, some 80 here too. That might be 80 there. And then, once in a while there's that monster client that can do 160 megahertz channel width and has data that it needs to transmit or receive that uses it all. That's a good indicator. One of the things that questions I saw in the chat, and certainly put questions in the Q&A for us too, was why do we see most of these APs in our examples configured for 20 megahertz? And this is one of the reasons. Now there's other reasons, but one of the reasons why is these super wide channels are just really inefficient when it comes to spectrum utilization. Often, the primary channel gets saturated and the secondary channels are just very lightly used, only occasionally when clients are able to do that. So that's one of the reasons. The other major reason, though, is we break up our spectrum into smaller channel widths. We have more non-overlapping channels we can use, each one of which is a contention domain, which allows for more parallel transmitting and receiving. And the whole system ends up being more efficient and faster.
Right on. Okay. Wow, here's another really interesting one. I think
bad flashbacks.
Yeah, this is this audio visual example.
Yes.
Look at how and this is in a retail store where there was, AV equipment. Again, the duty cycle pretty much 24/7, completely destroying these Uni 3 channels. Maybe this is the wireless HDMI that you were talking about. This does not look like Wi-Fi protocol, Jim, does it?
No, it doesn't. It definitely has a different appearance. You can see over on the left-hand side of the graph, these are all APs, and that's kind of typical as to what Wi-Fi looks like in those channels. And this is some weird, who knows what it is, protocol, maybe something proprietary.
Right.
Maybe something digital. It kind of has that look like it's changing around its modulation quite a bit, but it's not Wi-Fi, and it's not ever stopping from transmitting. And it's really just annihilating 4 channels up there in Uni 3. So
it's a shame because those Uni 3 channels are depended upon. Because they're, often because of the non-DFS nature, there are some parts of the world that, whether, Uni 1 and Uni 3 really need to be as clean as possible in order to get the result that's desired. So this is really a shame. Okay, and our last one, over here on the right side of your screen, look at this. You see this? This is the wiggle worm. This is the snake. And this is bad news. So this snake here, Jim, you and I were talking about this, 100% duty cycle. Again, this is 24/7 because we've got time on the y-axis. Maybe a motion sensor? What do you think?
That's what it is. It's a motion sensor that was part of a security system to make sure tracking movements around a entrance and exit door. And I like this one actually. And actually we see this specific signature much more often all of a sudden. These systems are getting deployed in many places. But I like this one because it looks fairly innocent. It's just that kind of thin, wispy blue line, no big deal. Just, what's the problem here? Well, the problem is, like we talked about, because the duty cycle is 100%, it's transmitting all the time. If that signal's getting picked up by Wi-Fi clients and APs operating on this channel, looks like 157, if I'm correct, they'll just defer and they won't transmit, even though maybe it's not super loud, it's not using the whole channel. If they pick up that signal, they won't transmit, and the signal never goes away.
It's a
So very,
wasted
very
channel.
disruptive.
Yeah, a wasted channel.
Yeah, and then look, it kind of shifts its frequency here and there, bumping into channel 153, and ugly.
Yeah, indeed. And that's it. We did it, Jim. So, I mean, we saw a variety of examples. Again, unlicensed spectrum. You're going to have noisy 802.11 neighbors, of course, but what about all of the other stuff that's out there as well? It is the Wild West, proprietary, not proprietary, everything in between. The spectrogram is just a great tool for detecting. So thank you very much for helping out with that.
Absolutely. That was fun.
Yeah.
So
all right, let's do it. Let's do questions.
Yeah, I got a few questions, and we'll jump right in. So Fang asks, do you have data that shows how much of the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum is loaded by Bluetooth versus Wi-Fi traffic? Looks like we don't see a lot of Wi-Fi traffic in 2.4 gigahertz. And that's true. You know, a lot of enterprises are trying to get most of their Wi-Fi devices operating in 5 gigahertz. Everything that can support that band should be operating there, because, like you said, the flood of Bluetooth traffic is very real, and a lot of our customers see that. Anywhere that's really open to the public, it's going to be people bringing in their phones and other devices, and it's, you know, the Bluetooth utilization can go sky high.
I would even say this in talking with some folks out there. And when we ask the questions, hey, how much are you using 2.4? Are you depending upon it? No, we don't depend upon it, but we keep it on for the guest network. I would even consider turning it off on the guest network. You don't want guests to come on and experience all of the different types of things that we just saw. And, you know, sometimes the guest is the CEO, right, on the network. So, you know, just be careful with that, if you will.
Yeah, I like that. Guests are definitely VIPs in many businesses. They're your customers coming in to, you know, have a transaction with you. Let's give them a good experience. So David has a question. It says, can you tell the difference from the spectrograph between one heavily used AP and several APs operating on the same channel? Will they look the same? That's a good question, David. If there's one heavily used AP, you really can't tell the difference. What a spectrum analysis tool does is just looks at the energy. And so the energy from any Wi-Fi transmitter will appear identical, except for the differences in signal strength. And if they're transmitting on the same channel, you probably won't be able to differentiate them with spectrum analysis. That's where you go one layer up from layer 1 to layer 2 and use a Wi-Fi scanner to see the different BSSIDs operating on those channels.